Good morning, everyone, and good evening for people joining in from various parts of the world. We are again live Saturday morning, Friday evenings for a lot of people. This is a 68th international weekly meeting for CMAAO. We are covering the COVID edition. We are 24th of July, 9:30 a.m. A session which was started by Dr. K.K. Agarwal 68 sessions before, something he wanted to bring everyone together on a platform. He was successful bringing international faculties to discuss on the pandemic crisis. We are lucky that we all are together fighting for the nation. Today, we are discussing a very, very important topic. Oxygen, as we all know, is everywhere in the air. But we still, as a country in India and various parts of other world, struggled for oxygen during this second wave. We understand the need of oxygen. Even though the oxygen is there in the body and everywhere, still the hospitals and the medical fraternity was facing it very hard for providing the oxygen for the patients. To understand the importance of the topic and oxygen crisis and how do we prepare for the future, we have among with us Dr. Rahul Pandit. He's an MD. He's a director of critical care Fortis Hospital in Mumbai. He's also a visiting consultant in ICU for a hospital in Australia. He's a very, very important member of National Task Force appointed by Supreme Court of India. He's also the Maharashtra Task Force member for COVID-19. I will now invite him for the presentation, and then we will take the question answers and followed by the country updates. Over to you.
Good morning, everyone, and good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, Saurabh, for a very kind introduction. And it is indeed an honor and a pleasure to be here with you guys today. And of course, Dr. K.K. Agarwal was very, very dear to all of us. In fact, in the last 1 year, he's been sort of invited me for at least 4 or 5 of his med talks as well. But this is the first occasion that I'm coming on the CMAAO platform. So I'm just going to start sharing my screen while we talk. Can you see my slides? Everyone is able to see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Look, oxygen therapy is something which we have taken for granted. So simply put in, if some patient comes in, the first thing which crosses a physician's mind or a doctor's mind is that let's check the oxygen saturation. And even if there is a delay in oxygen saturation being checked by a couple of minutes, the first thing many people would do is just to put the patient on oxygen. And that's where what our teaching has been for several decades, that oxygen is good, hypoxia is bad. And we've never really given a thought that is too much of oxygen good. Of course, in the pediatric and neonatal world, too much of oxygen is bad is something which is very well established, and you only give oxygen when it's necessary. And in the last decade or so, there has been significant amount of research in terms of clinical trials looking at optimal level of oxygen to be delivered in the body, and what would be useful and what would probably be harmful is a very difficult thin line to differentiate, but that has been an effort by many of the researchers across the globe. And we've conveniently, I must say, I must confess as well, that in the pandemic, barring a few key opinion leaders and doctors, many of us actually contributed to the oxygen crisis by targeting oxygen saturations, which were very, very high, considering that the liberal oxygen strategy would probably work best in this disease, which causes a profound hypoxia, especially the silent hypoxia, which we all know about, which COVID causes. And this alveolar equation, where we actually look at the PF ratio, was not possible to be looked at in many places, at least in some of the developing countries, because the ABG facilities were not there in some of the field hospitals, some of the rural areas, and where they were there, probably once a day ABG was even difficult. So what we relied on essentially was saturation. And obviously, as a mark of safety, everybody wants a saturation to be above 95, 96, 97%. 100 is better. That's how the whole concept came into. And we all know the oxygen. I mean, these slides I'm just going to quickly skip through. But what we know is that travel of oxygen from the atmospheric air right down to the tissue where it matters, which is the mitochondria, there is a cascade, and it sort of keeps on dropping at every level. And if you see at the tissue level and the mitochondria level, it probably drops as low as in single digits. That's the PaO2 I'm talking about. And we really don't require a lot of oxygen at the level of the mitochondria. But because of this cascade, you have a lot of oxygen which basically drops down as the body starts to utilize it at different levels until it goes to the mitochondrial level. And that's why we need to keep that PaO2 around 60 millimeters of mercury, which is depicted quite nicely here, that the saturation of 100% sort of goes on with the PaO2 of 100 millimeters of mercury. If you come down somewhere around 92, 93, you're dropping your PaO2 in your 80s, which is fine and acceptable. But once we go below that, you actually start going onto the slippery slope of the oxygen dissociation curve. And once you're in the slippery part of the oxygen dissociation curve, you really don't know that whether you can actually correlate your oxygen in the blood, which is in millimeters of mercury or kilopascals, to a saturation. And if the saturation is showing 70%, 72%, it's very difficult to actually understand whether you've started having tissue level hypoxia or not. And that's where the limitations of pulse oximeter are also there, because at beyond certain level, the pulse oximeters don't give you an accurate reading. So my topic today, for the next 10 or 15 slides, maybe I'm going to talk about hyperoxia and what we know in clinical medicines. Then I'm going to talk about the crisis which happened in India. And probably it is a similar story across the world wherever they've had oxygen problems, and some of the steps which we can take to mitigate it. So hyperoxia is defined as a PaO2 above 100 millimeters of mercury for a long time. It's unknown what the prolonged duration would be, but we probably consider it to be in hours, not minutes, that's for sure. If you have a FiO2 of 100% or 1, you deliver to a patient, there is a whole lot of good and bad effects which happen. And some of the good effects, we know that, your vascular PaO2 improves, your pericapillary diffusion improves, your oxygen delivery improves, the inflammation probably starts to sort of settle down by hypoxia-inducing factor going down. But a counter effect also starts happening, where your vascular perfusion may start decreasing. While the PaO2 may improve, perfusion may go down. The radical oxygen species or reactive oxygen species will go up, and they will cause more problems in terms of nitrooxidative stress in the tissue level, and your mitochondrial consumption of oxygen may go down, your ATP synthesis may go down. And depending on the organ which we are looking at, there are various effects of hyperoxia. So we know that PaO2 basically causes a little bit of atelectasis if given unnecessarily high. That's the research which many of the anesthetists have also done. If you have a shunt, it will worsen the shunt. And there is something called the Lorentz-Smith effect, where a pulmonary oxygen toxicity may present as an inflammation, ultimately leading to pulmonary edema. Similarly, vascular effects, cardiac output may drop down, heart rate sort of goes down, and some patients are dependent on the cardiac output with their heart rate. That sort of starts having a problem. Metabolically, your NADH, your succinate dehydrogenase, and complex 1 and complex 2 all start to create problems in their metabolic field. And the Paul Bert effect can sometimes give rise to profound vasoconstrictions in the lystonic-clonic seizures, but obviously these are very, very rare side effects. Over the last 9 or 10 years, and I'm not counting the last 2 years because I've got another slide where in the last couple of years, so much has been sort of talked about in hyperoxia. But these are some of the trials which have been published. And if you look at the number of patients, the number of patients are significantly high. They are looking at 6,000 patients. Some of them are looking at 200-300 patients or so. But a number of trials which have actually talked about various oxygen targets. So FiO2 titrated to keep an oxygen target of 94 to 98 in the oxygen ICU trial. The Hyper-2S trial, again, had a very low threshold, the SpO2 between 88 and 95, beg your pardon. So there have been different reasons why these trials were done. looking at ICU, septic shock, myocardial infarction, stroke, cardiac arrest. And universally, it looked like that the restrictive oxygen strategy probably was good. It was helping patients in terms of their mortality, or if it was not a mortality, it was at least helping in the time spent in the hospital was lesser, recovery time was better. The size of the infarct, especially in stroke patients, was changing. And this is a study which was published in Chest last year, which looked at retrospectively around 35,000 patients. And they found that the oxygen optimal saturation was between 94 to 98%. And if a patient spent around 40% time in that oxygen optimal saturation, as opposed to 80% of his time in that optimal saturation, the mortality worsened. So if you actually had a patient spend only 40% of the time, the mortality was 50% higher than those who spent in that 94 to 98% saturation. So you really don't need to have the 97 to 100% target. You need to have a little lower target. This was another trial which was normal oxygen versus liberal oxygen strategy versus restrictive oxygen strategy, or the ICU oxygen ICU trial. And the targets were 94 to 98 versus 97 to 100, roughly around 230 patients in each. And they found an absolute reduction in the mortality, 11.6 versus 20.2%, with the fragility index of 3 patients. And the number needed to treat was 3. There were also some secondary outcomes which the study was not powered for, but nevertheless, new organ failure, respiratory failure, shock, liver dysfunction, and renal dysfunction were some of the secondary objectives looked at. And then if you come to the last around 24 to 36 months, we have some other trials which have come out, again looking at a restrictive oxygen strategy. So these are some of the trials. These are older ones. Myocardial infarction. We all know that now the American Heart Association does not allow you to give oxygen until the oxygen saturation is actually low. Whereas previously, around 10 years ago, people would put oxygen to these patients who came in with acute myocardial infarction. And the rationale for that is that too much of oxygen may actually worsen your outcomes. So there were a number of studies again looking at acute coronary syndrome. This was a study which was essentially done in patients with first contact from emergency department, where they were given a 6 liters of oxygen versus ambient air, the Swedish heart trial. Again, they found them to have absolutely no difference. The Kaplan-Meier curves initially separated out, but overall it stayed that way. The stroke oxygen trial published in JAMA, no benefit of oxygen in patients with stroke. Perhaps there was some harm seen. There was no mortality difference. So I think in a nutshell, unnecessary oxygen to patients was probably not good. And again, giving oxygen to patients to try and achieve a target of 97 to 100% was not helping these patients at all. So I think the reality was that many of them were following a liberal oxygen strategy. Most patients got more oxygen than what was required. And with the numbers rapidly increasing in the second wave, it did not help. An oxygen liberal strategy was actually going to cause a lot of problems. Now, this is from the newspaper. I have not got this from anywhere else. This is from the newspaper. You can look at the oxygen allocation in 12 states where the surge happened. And you can look, the dark blue is talking about a demand, and the light blue is talking about the allocation between the states. And you can see that some of the states, like Delhi, Uttar Pradesh, Gujarat, the allocation was probably having a negative effect in these 4 or 5 states initially. And then there was some surplus in some of the other states. But as the pandemic worsened, this is now looking from April 20th to almost to the May 2021. You see that the country's oxygen requirement went up by almost 9 or 10 folds. So there was no way we could have met the oxygen demand which was there, and hence the crisis precipitated. There were a lot of talk about different allocations being done. There was a lot of talk about oxygen not available, but most states tried their best, and I think within a couple of days' time, the rational use of oxygen came in, the allocation improved. But let's go to some of the strategies which were actually looked at. So the first thing was that you need to calculate what is the demand. And if you look at some of these surveys which were done personally by me, We looked at around 30 hospitals, all hospitals, public as well as private, and found that for approximately 100 beds, you need around 1.5 metric ton of oxygen per day. This is liquid medical oxygen per day. And that goes with the fact that you look at around 30% of these beds would be ICU beds and 70% of these beds would be oxygen beds. And this is only about pandemic. This is not in a normal course hospital. Normal hospital requirement would be much lesser. But in a pandemic where most patients would be on oxygen and hence they are admitted to the hospital, the requirement is very, very high. And if you look at around 700,000 liters of gaseous oxygen, it translates to around 1 metric ton. So you require around million liters of gaseous oxygen for these patients per day. The problem was that the dynamic change in the need was not easily available. So if you look at a country of the size of India, and I'm sure some of the other countries have got similar sort of concerns, to the point that now several hospitals were converted to COVID hospitals. Several cities had the jumbo units or the field hospitals set up. There was very little information about a dynamic change in terms of the requirement for oxygen. And obviously, it was dependent on various factors, whether the ventilators were used, where the non-invasive ventilators were used, and high flow nasal oxygen cannulas were used. These HFNOs or HFNC, what some people call it, are actually oxygen guzzlers. Though they are fantastic from an intensivist point of view, from my point of view, the patient compliance, the overall the effect it has on a patient in terms of clinical benefit, everything actually goes in its favor. But in a pandemic, they almost became like the Hummers of the motorcades, where they were guzzling oxygens by liters, because the minimum flow you keep is around 20 to 60 liters per minute of flow, and if the oxygen requirement was high, it was a problem. So there was a difficulty in judging the dynamic needs of the oxygen, and supply was essentially limited to four various ways. You had liquid oxygen, medical oxygen. You had oxygen cylinders of various sizes, from portable to jumbo cylinders, what we call them here. There are now some different tanks as available as well, which probably store liquid medical oxygen, but they're still called as cylinders. Then the oxygen concentrators, which are very portable and can be used. They are dependent on the product called as zeolite to sort of have air concentrated into oxygen. And then you have a pressure swing absorption plants, or the PSA plants, which in the country at that time, there were not many, but they were seen to be as the best solution to actually have. So supply was only going to come from these four things. Let's look at the liquid medical oxygen. There was a fixed production happening. We had enough oxygen. In fact, we had surplus oxygen when the need was not much. And there was a provision to increase the supply of the oxygen as well. However, the ferocity of the second wave was such that within a short span of time, we had, as I just showed you before, we had almost 7 or 8 times increase in our oxygen requirement. So we had to turn towards industrial grade oxygen available. And a lot of industries are there which actually have oxygen as a byproduct, the steel industry being one of the main ones. And a lot of oxygen was sourced from there. And the initial thought was that, is this oxygen actually medical grade oxygen? A lot of scientists were discussed and talked about. Industrial grade oxygen seemed to be as good as medical grade oxygen, though the purity of that may be around 93 to 95%, as opposed to 95% and above for industry for a medical oxygen. But in terms of impurities, they were not harmful. There were no harmful impurities. But the problem was that these industrial oxygen plants were scattered across the country. And because they are coming mainly from the steel plants, they were actually the rural part of the country, where the demand was probably there, but they were not able to utilize, because not many parts in the country, the rural parts in the country, have got liquid medical oxygen tanks in their hospital. Liquid medical oxygen tanks were actually concentrated in the cities. Plus, there was another problem, that this was a shifting pandemic. The pandemic moved from west to north, from north to east and south. And that's how the pandemic actually shifted. And these liquid medical oxygen plants, or the industrial plants, were scattered across the city. And as we all know, that these cryogenic tankers which carry these liquid medical oxygen, they have got a speed limit as per the Government of India regulations for safety. So if it had to travel a distance of say 2,000 kilometers from one end of the country to the other end of the country, instead of taking say averagely a day and a half or two, they were taking around 3 to 4 days to reach. And that's how the crisis sort of changed very quickly into a real shortage. The problem with oxygen cylinders was they were limited refilling plants, and PSA machines were unable to fill the oxygen. So whenever the PSA machines were there, they were not sort of modified to fill in to fill in oxygen cylinders. And the cylinders were easy to hoard as well. So there were a lot of people who probably cashed onto it. And the hygiene practices in maintaining these cylinders and refilling them were questioned at one time. Obviously, nothing came out of that. It probably was not the big cause of worry as such, but that was some of the questions which were raised initially. The concentrators came across as a lifesaver. Though several of these millions of concentrators which were coming into the country were given by other countries because they realized that the oxygen demand in India, there was a problem because many of them have got a limitation of flow. They only give you around 5 or 10 liters of oxygen. Hoarding was possible, but it was not a big problem because it was controlled quite nicely by government. But it has a technical problem. So if let's say you use oxygen concentrator, which has got a maximum capacity of 5 liters, the moment you start using it at 5 liters per minute, in some time, the maximum capacity, the purity starts to drop down. So instead of getting 94, 95% plus grade oxygen, you start getting the oxygen purity in terms of 80s. And that's when the oxygen saturation starts to drop down. So there is a bit of a concern in that. The PSA plants, it's a sustainable solution as the best backup use. Beg your pardon, but they could not be operationalized overnight. Again, the availability of those PSA plants, the various materials which it required, the zeolite which it required, had to be imported, and to set them up into the hospitals took some time before a sustainable solution as a backup could be brought in. So I think solutions where we needed to firefight at that time: dynamic needs, allocation formulas, distribution techniques, sub-stores for ease of transport, and then follow the Mumbai model from where me and Professor Shashank Joshi come, which was quite talked about and praised across the globe. So every bed had to be mapped, and there was a very quick, effort to do that. Real-time data from the hospital sourcing remained a problem, but I think more or less after around 2 weeks or so, we started getting good data from the hospital about the requirement each day. And that was because each hospital by then actually appointed an oxygen committee who would give you projections what the oxygen requirement was there for the next day. I would not be able to comment the same about the rural part of the country, but at least the cities, this was happening quite nicely. The allocation models were looked at. Various predictive models by our IIT engineers put in various allocations and permutations and combinations to look at the allocation. And they sort of predicted which direction the pandemic is moving. And accordingly, the states nearest to the oxygen plants or the industrial plants were then allocated oxygen from there. So the nearest supply points were identified. And there was this concern about decentralized versus a centralized allocation. Ultimately, I think the decentralization of the allocation actually worked quite nicely, though there was a oversight from the center all the time because it had to be an equitable distribution. But at the state level, when the distribution started happening between the states, I think this crisis automatically started to improve. The cryogenic tankers, as I mentioned, were a problem. So innovative solutions, so suggested by the Maharashtra Task Force, the roll-on, roll-off express trains, where we actually put these tankers on these express trains and traveled a distance which would have normally taken a tanker to cover for around 4 days or so within a day's time by having train come from one point of the country to the other point of the country. We also help by transporting empty tanks via aircraft. The military aircraft they used to transport to the nearest oxygen supply point. And from there, the cryogenic tankers would be sent across by a Ro-Ro express or by road, depending on how the allocation was. So there was a very quick innovation in this. And I think this actually helped to ease the crisis very quickly. The Mumbai model was followed quite nicely. There was a decentralized process. Mumbai as a city is distributed naturally in 24 wards by the Municipal Corporation of Mumbai. And these 24 wards had a very good mapping of the data of the beds available, number of patients. In fact, the allocation of beds, whether it's an ICU bed or a ward bed in Mumbai, is actually done centrally through a command center. And this command center talks to all of these 24 wards. So there is no way a person can be actually admitted in Mumbai without the Bombay Municipal Corporation knowing about it. So every bed is mapped, every admission is mapped. We were able to have an oxygen requirement. And what the municipal commissioner did was he created 6 sub-stores within the city. So a small tanker which would move very easily through the roads and traffic would actually come and fill up the liquid medical oxygen in the city. Whereas the larger tankers which were bringing the oxygen into the city were just dumping it into these 6 sub-stores and not going from hospital to hospital trying to deliver oxygen. I think this model helped. And Mumbai actually, despite being a city of the similar size of Delhi, where the oxygen requirement was around 600, 700 metric tons, Mumbai managed it within around 250 to 270 metric tons on an average, even during the worst time of the pandemic in the second phase. And that was only because the distribution was good. And we also had a very long-term sustainable solution in Mumbai, where we implemented the restrictive oxygen strategy as a part of our Maharashtra task force. I'm just going to skip on to this slide and I'll come back probably. Just last couple of slides to talk about. So we actually introduced the oxygen stewardship program, not a new terminology. It's a terminology which has been there for some time. We've actually used it for our antibiotic stewardship program quite a lot. But I think when you have a crisis, we need to have some formulation where we can use a resource in an effective way. So we started changing the oxygen saturations in monitored beds from 97 to 90, 100% to basically try and allow a saturation to be between 90 to 94%. We chose to have a lower end of the normal. And we also had patients who were not monitored continuously, where the oxygen saturation was allowed to be between 93 and 96%. And as soon as that was achieved, the doctors and the nurses, they were requested to start dialing down the oxygen. The motto behind it being, if you save 1 liter of oxygen, it was as good as producing 1 liter of oxygen. All the leaks, old pipes, circuits, which were causing wastage were fixed. Every hospital, there was a request to appoint an oxygen steward who would go into the wards and look at knobs, look at patients who were probably saturating well. Can they be weaned off oxygen? There's an active effort to do that. Many hospitals like my hospital, Hinduja Hospital, already had oxygen committees in place. Some of the new hospitals, some of the other hospitals actually installed the new committee where they would plan and execute the plan wherever necessary. But more importantly, they would actually look at the requirement of the oxygen for next day and plan it accordingly. And I think that was what was working in our favor. So the Mumbai model was to increase the capacity building, to essentially have more oxygen production, to keep emergency oxygen stores for around 2 weeks requirement for the country, something which the country is looking at. And I think that we are working quite rapidly towards that, achieving that. Several PSA plants, courtesy Government of India, have been now established in rural as well as in the urban Indian population, hospitals, beg your pardon. And I think we are now in a better way prepared for the third wave in terms of oxygen than what we were before. Thank you very much for a patient hearing. I just thought I will cover a broader sense of what oxygen has been doing in the country. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Rahul, for one of the very important topics, which actually were very close to the Indian scenario. And I'm assuming this is also a requirement for a lot of Asian countries where the oxygen was very important. So I will invite the question answers, but before that, I can invite all our guests who are joined in and the members of CMAAO. I would like to start with Dr. Chong from Singapore Medical Association. He's a chair for CMAAO. Dr. Ravi Maidu, Malaysian Medical Association, immediate past president of CMAAO. Dr. Ashraf from Pakistan Medical Association and first vice president of CMAAO. Dr. Pillay from member of World Medical Council. Dr. Salma, president of Pakistan Medical Association. Dr. Angelica from South Africa Medical Association. Dr. Jamal Chaudhary from Bangladesh Medical Association. Dr. Akhtar Hussain from South Africa Medical Association. Dr. Mary from Japan Medical Association. Dr. Russell from Australia, UNESCO, Dr. Shashank Joshi from India, COVID Task Force, Dr. Bukhari from Pakistan, Dr. Manika Vasudev from US, and then we have a lot of all guests from Singapore and Malaysia joining in. Well, we welcome you for the show. We welcome you in the CMAAO meeting. Over to the chair to take the question answers from people. Dr. Chong.
Thank you, Saurabh. Thank you very much. And welcome everyone to our CMAAO meeting again. This is, I believe, our 67th meeting in a row.
This is 68, sorry. Yeah.
Okay, 68, I stand corrected. and thanks, Dr. Rahul, for that wonderful presentation on oxygen situation in your country. We don't have such a problem, for example, in Singapore, but it's quite fascinating to hear about the challenges you went through. And of course, something that we all forgot about was hyperoxia, the deleterious effect of having large amounts of oxygen or high concentrations of oxygen with high saturations, something that, a lot of us have completely forgotten about. So I just wanted to ask a question. I was told I read some reports that the mucormycosis was linked to the oxygen supply. Is there any truth in that? Before I open the questions to the floor.
I was expecting this question by someone, so it's good that it came by the first question. Actually, me and Dr. Joshi, we published a report, a series of patients, around 5,000 patients, where we did not find that it was related to oxygen supply, but it was definitely related to what we know, the glucose levels, as well as your overall use of immunosuppressive therapy. So yes. This was from my patients. We had around 5,000 odd patients admitted in our hospital. We had a very strict nurse-driven glucose control policy, which most hospitals do anyways in the West. It's nothing new. But in India, it is still only few hospitals actually have a nurse-driven policy. We had zero incidence of mucormycosis in our patients. So I don't believe that mucormycosis was caused purely by oxygen. There may have been some impurities there. There were a lot of thought processes behind that. One of the commonly mentioned thought process was that when the oxygen was delivered and humidified through these small canisters which are connected to the oxygen flow meter, and the water which is kept there, maybe that is what was causing it, the humidity. But when I spoke with microbiologist and Professor Arunlok Chakravarti from PGI Chandigarh, is a very, very noted microbiologist from the country, and he published the most on mucormycosis in the entire world. He said it cannot happen because there the oxygen is agitated because the oxygen is flowing through that water. So the water is actually agitated, and you can't have any organism grow in agitated water. So I think that theory was then abandoned. The other theory was that did industrial oxygen cause it? I think there's a lot to say that in fact the industrial oxygen is as pure in terms of impurities, because when they use it for steel making, they don't want impurities to be there at all. So there cannot be any impurities in that kind of an oxygen. I probably feel steroids, poor glucose control, and use of immunosuppressive therapies like tocilizumab, bevacizumab, eculizumab, and so on and so forth, which were tried as desperate measures, probably contributed to the immunity going down and giving an opportunity for this opportunistic infection to come up.
Excellent answer. Actually, one of my patients living here locally told me about that. He thought it was oxygen, so that's why I brought it up. But it's an excellent answer you've given us. And yes, Dr. Chaudhary, yes.
In this point only, because Dr. Rahul Pandit, I actually joined late. So just not my question, but in relation to the question already Dr. Chong raised, that actually Bangladesh is also having the same situation like India. You can just compare it, but we are having very less mucormycosis here. What may be the reason behind it? Because you are already recorded more than 10,000. What I have seen, but in Bangladesh, it's not like that. There are some, but not like this.
So whether the virus is actually contributing, the mutant virus is contributing to it, is also one of the theories which was put up. I find it very difficult to even say that why we did not have mucormycosis in the first wave, why we only had it in the second wave. So that's a very difficult answer to actually give. But I personally don't feel that there was one particular reason. I think there was a combination of reasons why this opportunistic infection actually flourished. And that span of the mucormycosis was around 4 weeks. Most of these infections were reported within that 4 to 5 weeks time span. And now it's gone. Now I have not seen a mucormycosis for almost a month. Not a single case has come to us. Dr. Doshi, you want to add something on that? He is also one of the co-authors with our paper, and he's done his independent work. He's an endocrinologist. He's published a lot of it. And in fact, just before our paper, he did another paper with looking at mucormycosis, particularly in the country.
Thank you.
So
Thank Dr. Joshi.
Two things, Dr. Jamal. If you take all the mucormycosis cases in the world, more than 2/3 lie in India. And we don't know the reason for that. And we have published a paper, Dr. Avdesh Singh, myself, and Dr. Bhupeshwar. I'll share it on the group. I'll share both the papers, one which Dr. Pandit and me have published, and one why this particular microbe is peculiar to Indian soil. We really don't have answers. All we know is there are two underlying predilections. One is uncontrolled diabetes and excessive use of steroids look to be the compelling causes. We know that this epidemic came with the second wave. So we thought the syncytium formation of the Delta strain, Delta strain forms a syncytium, and the syncytium formation of the Delta strain may have led to a predilection. This is a hypothesis again, which needs validation, potentially led to this explosion of mucor. And now mucor has completely gone. It came with the second wave with a bang, it completely went away. But we have never seen so much of mucor in our whole life. So we will share with you both the papers. Unlike India, rest of the world doesn't see mucormycosis. These are very unusual situations. Why it is so peculiar to a particular geography and not to another. Whether it is linked to humidity, whether it is linked to the tropicality of the country, whether it is linked to the tropical environment inside the ISU, we don't know. We have unanswered questions. We have tried to address some of them in our article. I will share the full text of both the articles on our group.
Interesting, Dr. Joshi. You mentioned that it's found in the soil. We have another very interesting bug here in Singapore, melioidosis, pseudomeli. So we found that actually this pseudomeli is found in certain, for example, sports fields here in Singapore. So people playing, for example, contact sports in those fields have a higher propensity to catch this melioidosis. And we know this was actually discovered in Vietnam. The American GIs caught it from the soil and so on. So it's quite fascinating that you've just mentioned that this mucormycosis is actually found in the soil.
That's true.
Fascinating.
Dr. Chong, regarding today's presentation, can I just ask something?
Sure, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rahul Pandit. Actually, later I joined. I think definitely it was good if it would have been from the beginning. But to my mind, actually, there is a question that high flow nasal oxygen, where it is used, there are a lot of accidents we have seen. Which you have mentioned already that you have to fix up these leaks and other pipes and other problem there in the supply chain. So it's okay, but it is there. But can we just avoid high flow nasal if we use the CPAP? CPAP uses less oxygen, and high flow nasal actually uses almost 70, 80, 60 liters. CPAP by 20 liters CPAP, you can just have the same effect if the patient can tolerate. So did you see in India like that, where there is a scarcity of oxygen, which Bangladesh also seems to face in the future?
Look, not many units across the country actually have a lot of high flow nasal cannula machines, to be very honest with you. I have been using high flow nasal cannulas in Australia almost 18 years ago. Whereas in India, it's only come across in the main practice in the last 4 or 5 years. And very few of us, in fact, before the pandemic, I had only 2 machines in my hospital. Now we have 20 in our hospital. But hospitals like us are very, very few which have invested into high flow nasal cannula. I think they were not the cause of the shortage at all. But obviously, they could have contributed to it when the shortage happened. So we shifted from high flow nasal cannula use to a CPAP or a bi-level ventilation with a non-invasive ventilator use electively, so that during that 4 weeks of crisis, very, very few patients who required nasal cannula to be used, high flow nasal cannula to be used because of their tolerance issue, we're the only ones who were given. Otherwise, most patients would tolerate a CPAP or a helmet CPAP quite well. And you're right, from a 15 to 20 liters flow, we are looking at increasing the flow to 40 to 60 liters per minute. As I have always said in my presentation also, I said 1 liter saved is 1 liter produced. So we need to save every liter of oxygen when you have a pandemic which is rising. And while today some of the developed countries may not have a problem, God forbid we have such a steep rise in cases anywhere in the world, there would be a thought given to saving oxygen now. I think this is the big lesson which we've all learned. And right now there is no shortage of oxygen. In fact, there is surplus oxygen in most part of the country and across the world. We can easily use whatever we want on the patients. But if something has to come back again in terms of numbers going up, we will have to go back to CPAP.
Thank you, Dr. Rahul. Any other questions from the floor?
Yeah, Dr. Pillai here.
Yes, Dr. Pillai.
Yeah. So the India has managed the situation very effectively. Within a week's time, it could. But actually, the production of oxygen was enough. But then the distribution part was defective because the long distance it has to travel, either liquid oxygen or cylinders or whatever. Even the oxygen carriers, suddenly the requirement increased. So effectively it was managed mainly by monitoring in every district level, every hospital ICU bed number, oxygen requirement were monitored, and even the supply was done through the district authority so that within a short period we could tide over the situation. And as has been pointed out, we are now in a position where we have surplus of oxygen. Only two questions. One is normally COVID first wave, we said if the concentration of oxygen is less than 95, you need oxygen or other ventilatory support. But now we have reduced it even only if it is 80 or 85, then you need supplementation of oxygen. And your comment on that, kindly you can give me. And then, of course, the second issue was the fire in ICU units where the high flow oxygen were used because of leak and the spark and electrical supply issues. It has produced, even that has been tied on. That was not an isolated issue in India alone, but even in other countries, the same issue has been there. So that again probably has been tied over. So the parameter for supplementing oxygen, have we now decided on a lower saturation, maybe 85 or 80 for oxygen supplementation?
Thank you, Dr. Pillai. That is why I actually put half of my first talk trying to justify that hyperoxia is bad. We don't, so at least in intensive care, there is good evidence that patients who require monitoring, patients who require intensive care, whether it's a ARDS patient, pneumonia patient, stroke, myocardial infarction, definitely we should be targeting oxygen saturation, which is restricted, oxygen supplementation, which is restrictive. And saturations can be basically in the low 90s, in fact, instead of the high 90s. In a pandemics mode, we actually, in our ICU, where the patient is continuously monitored, you can go to a saturation as low as 87, 88% to 92%. And that will definitely have a better outcome in terms of mortality. So to answer your question, yes, we should be targeting lesser oxygen saturation than what we were doing before. I don't think 80 or 85 is good, but certainly the evidence which is there right now that 88 and above in a monitored environment and 93 and above in an unmonitored environment is more than enough. You don't need to go below that, and you don't need to certainly go above that. And as soon as you reach that target, start dialing down the oxygen requirement by a liter every time, and or a FiO2 by 0.1, 0.2 every time, and see how well the patient maintains. So it's a dynamic process now. We can't be saying I'm going to put this patient on 40% oxygen overnight on the ventilator and extubating in the morning. If you come to our unit, several of them are now ventilated on 21% oxygen awaiting extubation. So, we are just ventilating them on room air, not because of hypoxia, but just trying to wean them off the ventilator. And that process may take 6 hours, but we certainly don't give them 30% oxygen, which I was doing a year ago, not too long ago, year and a half ago. Rarely I would put anybody on 21% oxygen awaiting extubation. But now it's the norm. Many of them are on 21% oxygen. They don't need oxygen. We don't put them on oxygen.
Thank you.
Fascinating to hear because of the pandemic, right? How we ended up with a more rational and judicious use of oxygen due to necessity and circumstances. Fascinating. Yes, I've heard my respiratory physicians talk about 88%, as low as 88% in a monitored situation. Yes, I have actually heard of that. So, any other questions from the floor?
Yes, yes, thank you.
Dr. Bukhari, yes.
Thank you very much, respected friends, and very nice talk on the oxygen and very important topic. And can I ask the same question related to the black fungus? Was there any association with the saturation of the oxygen and the black fungus? One thing, and why it is more common, Delta virus is all over the world. And same we are looking in the Pakistan case, few cases. But why the black fungus is more common in these areas? And the second question, my question is that most of the things we have seen in Pakistan, it is not the deficiency or the shortage of the oxygen. It is the misuse and wastage of the oxygen in the hospital. What you will advise about it?
Thank you, Dr. Bukhari.
Look, I think, Dr. Bukhari, I agree with you that wastage needs to be fixed. And that's why the oxygen stewardship program, I think, is going to be the next big thing across the world, where you have rational use of oxygen and avoid wastage at all costs. So, I mean, all of the countries, you can name any country in the world, would have hospitals built up 20, 30 years ago, and maybe having pipes and tubings which may have some leakages. So we need to fix those. We need to replace those on priority. I think we should not be wasting even 1 liter of oxygen. Wastage is absolutely criminal.
Yes.
Coming to your other question about incidence of mucor fungus.
You mean the pandemic has naked our all system?
Yeah, pandemic has actually opened our eyes towards things which we were taking for granted before.
Yeah.
Who on this panel would have thought that oxygen may become a problem in the world? Where 24 months ago, nobody would have thought of that. So we need to be aware that we are learning. The pandemic is teaching us a lot of things. In fact, I call this pandemic as a guru. It teaches us every time. It's actually a big teacher. We've got to learn a lot of things from this pandemic. The second question about hypoxia and association of mucormycosis. Yes, mucormycosis being a fungus of an opportunistic infection, it actually thrives on a little bit on hypoxia as well. So hypoxia obviously contributed to it. But I think these are very difficult things to pinpoint because there was no randomization done that whether it was seen more in patients where a saturation below 90% or above 90%. But one thing was sure that all had high blood glucose. Almost 80% of them had high blood glucose. And the mucormycosis which was seen was typically rhino-orbitocerebral mucormycosis, ROCM, not the gastric or the renal or some other mucormycosis, because it can happen from head to toe, literally anywhere. But it was typically related to the one side of the face, which would involve, and then some of them would have a brain infiltration, which would become often fatal for them.
Thank you.
And why? Another part of my question: why it is more common? We are looking in the India because the Delta is now all over the world.
So,
is there any some association of the ICU management, or it is just only the media or something?
No, it's nothing to do with the ICU management. If you look at this Dr. Joshi just talked about it. If you look at the incidence of mucormycosis across the world, 80% of cases of mucormycosis have been reported from India, even before the pandemic. So even before the pandemic, India had a 80% incidence of mucormycosis, and a lot of it was to do with the fact that it's a common organism found in the soil, as we were just talking about. Why is it high? We don't know. Whether it's that's what Dr. Joshi said, whether it's a country's tropical nature, whether it's a soil. I'm sure it's no different in Pakistan and Bangladesh. That's the reporting of the cases is much more higher reported in literature in India. That's all.
Dr. Rahul, actually, I saw one article published from the New York, USA somewhere, but they were getting this food habit or liquor habit, something like that, cow urine, cow dung, like that. Using is it associated with that? Yeah, anything like that?
then nobody's been using that, Dr. Jamal. Nobody's been using that.
No. No, I have seen actually. That is the article I have seen. That some Indian Indian American has written this article.
No.
No,
That was a Twitter
I
post,
think no.
Jamal. That was
Yes.
a Twitter post, and that Twitter post he retracted later. But it has nothing to do with countdown or this thing. There is a link to soil. Like Dr. Chong said that there is a melioidosis and the sportsman
Yes.
and the polling. I have posted an article on our group which is looking at why 80% of the world Mucor cases are in India. And it has got to do a lot with the soil and host microbiology, which is not prevalent in the rest of the world. Which is why in Bangladesh, Pakistan, which are neighboring countries, also are not seeing it. And also it is a particular geography of India. It is not across all of India. Please read that article and send us our comments. And we actually can write a compare and contrast article under CMAAO, where we can show that how we have this more and how you all have not seen anything. So we can actually see a negative article as important. Like Dr. Pandit and me wrote a paper from Dr. Pandit's ICU for the last uh, 2 years, more than 5,000 cases. Not a single case of Mucor was documented. And that is linked to tight glycemic control and optimal use of steroids. So I think the risk factors remain the same. It is the acidotic environment in which this Mucor thrives and becomes invasive. And fundamentally, if you do not give that conducive environment, there's a lot of free living Mucor in the soil population.
Yes, you're right.
And that's why we don't see that. So that's something which is there. I put both the articles full text on the group. Please have a look at both of them.
Yeah. Fungus
So,
is
Dr.
actually ubiquitous
Dr. Joshi,
everywhere, and it's ubiquitous everywhere. It's all spores. It's flying everywhere. So I guess probably what you said is right. It's probably a local factor, meaning it's in the soil in that particular area and so on, and then from there, it propagates. So yes, Dr. Bukhari, anything else you want to ask?
The main, there were 3 risk factors as Dr. Joshi has told. More the patient, more there will be the risk factor, and more there will be the mucormycosis of the fungus. As we are looking the more cases in the India, that may be the one reason. What is the reason in Pakistan? One the topmost reason is the use of the steroids. One is the most common. And second most common cause in Pakistan, we looked 4 or 5 cases in the Karachi were the diabetic. And whenever missed, I asked the question. Another thing is that it should be related with the mismanagement in the ICU. That is when the patient developed acidosis, definitely this mucormycosis or black fungus is present in the atmosphere, in the soil. That will be definitely infected. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
Okay, before we
Dr.
get
Pillai
carried
here,
yes,
one clarification I want. We talk about medical oxygen and industrial oxygen.
yes.
With the pandemic, the government in India are asking bigger private hospitals to have their own oxygen generators. In the ideal situation, the oxygen concentration will be about 94%. And the medical oxygen is supposed to be 95 or above. Is there any difference between these two, or is there any other process involved after the oxygen generation to increase its purity or concentration?
I'll answer that question. So the PSA plants, the PSA plants which I mentioned in my talk, are the oxygen generating plants which are now being talked about and have been installed across the country. In the best use of that, they serve as a backup. They are not your primary source of oxygen. So they are your backup oxygen. So even the plants which produce, say, 10,000 liters per minute or 5,000 liters per minute producing plants are there. They're all put up as a backup to your liquid medical oxygen or your oxygen cylinders manifold. There are some regions in the country which are very, very remote, hilly regions in the country where they may be used as a primary source at times because the availability of oxygen to deliver it by tankers or by aircraft or anything is very, very difficult out there. But most people would have that as a backup. Right now, some of the big hospitals like CMC Vellore, some of the hospitals in Delhi like Medanta, our Fortis Hospital, we've all installed that as a backup. And that's more as a insurance policy rather than anything else. We don't intend to use that. But you are right, the oxygen which is produced by these are around 94, 95% purity as opposed to medical oxygen. But that's okay. The impurities are not harmful. It's just that the oxygen like the requirement is oxygen concentration is a little bit low in that. So instead of 1 liter, you may require 1.2 liters or 1.5 liters of oxygen to maintain the same saturation. But if it's used as a backup, it gives you that much of breathing space for the new oxygen to be delivered to you.
Thank you, Dr. Rahul. Now, before we get hijacked by mucormycosis, I think I'd like to ask everyone for an update because, you know, if we have about 20 minutes left before the next group comes in. Can I just ask around anybody else has any questions? If not, we'll move on to an update.
One more question actually, which
Yes.
yes. Dr. Rahul, I think you are working in the ICU department. I think if I'm not wrong, you are okay. Okay. So actually, initially in Bangladesh, actually we didn't have the much high flow nasal oxygen here, just no cannula. So we have seen the patients were taken to the directly invasive ventilation, and because we didn't have the other sources also or the oxygen. Okay, so later when high flow nasal oxygen were given and the most outcome was good, it seemed to be good actually. So I just asked one anesthetist here, anesthesiologist. He said that actually it's not much. That's different actually. He was telling it's the management. What do you say in this case of COVID pneumonia and this? What about this respiratory distress syndrome? Like, what do you think that whether high flow is better or subbing, or you don't have any other opinion?
No. So high flow can't be compared with invasive mechanical ventilation. Wherever patients require to be put on an invasive mechanical ventilation, there is no other option. You have to just do that. But if you compare it with the non-invasive ventilators like BiPAP or CPAP mode, then the high flow nasal cannula scores a little bit in terms of patient compliance. It is so much better to have a small nasal cannula stuck in, still greater CPAP flow, and patient is able to eat, is able to talk, communicate.
Yeah.
We were using quite a lot, I'm sure all of you are using quite a lot of prone position. Try getting yourself prone with a mask on a CPAP or a BiPAP machine versus a nasal cannula. And nasal cannula is so much easier to lie down prone, and patients can easily keep their head on one side, not be sort of bogged down by that tight straps across your head. It is more to do with patient compliance than anything else. I think the high flow nasal cannula is the way to actually go in terms of non-invasive ventilation from patient compliance point of view. But we have to be objective when we are using it in a oxygen scarcity, or when the pandemic numbers are rising. We need to keep an eye on that because they are oxygen guzzlers.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rahul. And if no more questions on oxygen, then we'll just move on to a country review. Can we start with, let's say, Dr. Chaudhary? Can you like to start and tell us what's happening in Bangladesh?
Thank you. Actually, we are just under strict lockdown from yesterday. Strict means even previously some sort of relaxations were given to the industries, mostly the garments industries. So this time the government has just locked everything almost, other than the emergency services, because the cases are increasing actually here. So the last 2 to 3 days, because it is less, so people actually are enjoying Eid vacation. So they didn't go for the test probably. So it will go on. Actually, it was more than 12,000, 13,000 like that per day. And the number of deaths also are increasing. Actually, it's more than 200 these days. So, and regarding the vaccination, actually, we are having some more vaccines nowadays. More are coming, and people are happy for the vaccination. And we have seen actually the effects of vaccination here. Here, previously our healthcare professionals actually were much infected, and we had a lot of deaths here in that sector. Now it is actually remarkably reduced. Actually, you can say, because of vaccination, because the frontline workers have been vaccinated already. So it's good actually here. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Pillay, you want to update us on what, or Dr. Joshi as well?
India is still going through the second wave, and it is very, very slowly plateauing. But here, the issue is that if you take different states, the status is entirely different. There are states where a number is in the 2-digit or 3-digit, and the TPR is very, very low. Whereas at least 3 states, we have 14,000 or 20,000 cases per day, and TPR remains 15 to 20%. So that variability is there. Just because of the variability itself, this second wave it will be flattening only slowly, and maybe in some states where a number is very, very low, may go on for a third phase. So that is the situation. Then another very interesting and useful study result has come out from ICMR, Indian Research Council, which says that antibody zero positivity is almost 67%. That means we are more or less attaining the herd immunity status on an average, whereas certain states still have 43% positivity, zero positivity, antibody levels are there. So this variability definitely is there, but the good part is that almost 64% of the population antibody positivity is there. That means we are more or less going to a herd immunity status, and immunization program has picked up, and by end of the year, by December, all those above 18 years will get vaccinated, and by then the supply of vaccine also is supposed to be 1.3 crores will be available. So 1 dose many have taken, and 2 dose definitely the number has to pick up. Definitely the status is quite satisfactory. Another useful information, it's not India based, but the study in European countries by scientists show that the RNA based vaccine, AstraZeneca and the like, there the antibody production process is almost continuous, and they may not, those who are taking AstraZeneca may not require revaccination or booster vaccination. And when there is a challenge by virus, definitely the antibodies will be definitely produced. And so the inherent capacity to combat another viral infection is much higher with AstraZeneca and the RNA-based recombinant method vaccines. So that's also is a useful information. So we are sort of under, the situation is under control, and vaccination process is going on, and fatality is less, and many of the states the infection is the plateauing, second wave plateauing is almost complete. Thank you.
Dr. Joshi, you want to tell us about your state, Maharashtra state?
Yeah, so I think I agree with Dr. Pillai, except for the exception of Kerala, Maharashtra, Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, and Northeast states and Tamil Nadu. The rest of India is more or less out of the second wave. That is clear cut. The second thing is that Dr. Pillai had alluded last time and this time also, that Kerala and Maharashtra are a little different from rest of India. Their timetable of the wave is a little different. They are the early starters. Kerala is still a cause of concern, but it is getting better. Maharashtra clearly is now weighted with a lot of floods and storms, and that has disrupted COVID care, including COVID deaths. But clearly from a base number of a daily number of around 8,000 cases, it has come down to 6,000 cases. Our districts of concern are still very much there and prevalent. Beyond the districts of concern, the good part is what Dr. Pillai alluded to, that the ICMR Zero survey, if it has to be believed, there is a large exposure of the population to the virus. If that is true and the vaccination program is in order, it is unlikely that we will have a explosive third wave. It looks that it will be a mutated third wave in the unexposed geographies, in the unexposed people. Right now, we still are thinning the thick tail of the second wave. Maybe it may take a month more for it to get thinned out. And then only we'll start thinking of a third wave. Third wave potentially will come between September to January. It appears that it will be mutated if the seropositivity numbers are appropriate. And overall, if you ask me, we are a little better. India is reporting from 40,000 cases a day. It has come down to around 35,000 or 30,000 cases a day. but it is stuck at that tail. And we are opening more and more. Our only worry is lack of adherence to COVID appropriate behavior. There are, this negative effect which has happened from UK when they saw people who are not masked at Wimbledon, at the Wembley Stadium, has made people more reckless. But they did not understand that 2 vaccines were given to most people there. And, they also are having a spike there. So I think, that has actually led to a little catastrophe in terms of our public health messaging is concerned. And we are trying to rework around that. But overall, India is stable. But I think cautiously optimistic that things will look better in the next couple of weeks.
Thank you, Dr. Joshi. And how about Prof. Ashraf? Do you have anything to update us on Pakistan?
Thank you very much. I think in Pakistan, although we are comfortable in a way, but we are on increase. And as far as the behavior and attitude of the public and masses is concerned, we are equally at par with Bangladesh or India. Hence, Mr. Chaudhary has told that there is the vocation, and in Pakistan, we have also the Eid, that is the Muslim festivity. And hence, people are enjoying all that, and there is the increase. And we are also having the different part in our country. In Punjab, there is much better, where I live in Lahore. And the Sindh province, now they are looking for the lockdown. And from Monday, they are going to have a serious restrictions on the movement, on the hotels, and also they are going to stop all the academic activities. So we are, although it is controlled, but it is very alarming in Pakistan as far as we see. As the Delta variant is concerned, in Pakistan, it is about now 70 plus. It is the Delta variant now which we are suffering from. And as it is promising from Sri Lanka, one professor has said that the vaccine from China that is more effective and preventive in the in field of this Delta variant. So that is promising for Pakistan, and it is evidence-based in a way that in Sindh, that is Karachi capital, there some of our friends, they studied and looked into that the only those people are over there who are not vaccinated. So it is, I think that is something positive for Pakistan, although we are in a very low. It is still about 5% of the population who has been vaccinated, but it is going on. It is alarming situation in Pakistan, but at the moment it is controlled indeed. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Marie to tell us about Japan. I just watched the Olympics opening last night. So Marie, do you have anything to tell us?
Thank you very much. Of course, all of you, we had an opening ceremony yesterday without audience.
Yeah.
So it was sad, pretty sad, but we don't have anything go further with that, because we have been every day we have around 5,000 people has been tested positive, and half of them are Delta variants. But luckily, the 65 and older has vaccinated at least once at about 80%.
Yes.
That means there are almost a few people had intubated or need oxygen. But now the trend is getting younger, and some child has been intubated, and I believe this will be the first. This was the first case that the child dead because of COVID-19 in Japan, and also there are many people visited in Japan because of Olympics. Of course, we are limited the numbers of the people who can come to Japan, but the effect will happen within 2 or 3 weeks. Thank you very much for every time. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. And I'd like to ask Dr. Hussein or Angelique to tell us what's happening in South Africa. Angelique, Dr. Hussein.
Morning.
Morning.
I will briefly touch on it, and then Dr. Hussein can also add. As for our vaccination program, on the Pfizer vaccines, we now have about 1.1 million who had received their second dosage, and about 4 million with the first Pfizer dosage. And on the Johnson & Johnson, we so far had about 1.16 million people vaccinated. Regarding our infection rate, the numbers are coming down. It seems as if we are slowly moving out of the third wave, but it's still unsure. We've got a very cold front this past 2 weeks, and yeah, I think it's going to contribute to maybe a rise again by the end of next week, as well as we're seeing an increase of death. We have seen yesterday 13,700 plus minus new COVID cases. We've got between 26 to 27% positivity rate. Something that's still alarming is our ICU admissions. So we have currently in ICU on a ventilated patients in that has been recorded is 1,200 patients. Admitted patients in the hospital currently 17,000, ICU patients 2,200 roundabout. Our death toll is going up. Yesterday it was over 400 recorded cases. Remember, we are also saying that we are under recording. Then what I am still concerned, because my province where I am practicing is very hard hit by this third wave. I am in total agreement with what Monica said. I think there's two complications that we're going to get going forward. One is diabetes because of the high dosages of cortisone that we are using to try to get them out of the inflammatory status. And something that is not, there's not a lot of discussion around it, but I have seen quite a few patients, and I think it's a type of myocarditis that we're going to see going forward with either an atrial fibrillation type of picture or irregular heartbeat. I think that this is just my own observation. I'm not sure whether anyone, other people also observing that. But for now, I think by the end of next week, we will know better where we are. And yeah, that is it. Dr. Adkar, is there anything that you would like to add? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yeah, I just wanted to highlight we had a massive super spreading event in Johannesburg and Durban area. So we are waiting for those last week's massive lootings and the massive crowd gathering. So we haven't got the statistic yet. So we'll see next week. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hussein. Alvin, do you have anything to add from Hong Kong? Alvin?
Hello, yes. Can I log out, Dr. Chong? Is that all right, Professor
Yes,
Chong?
thank you, Dr. Rahul. Thank you very much.
Thank
you very much for joining us,
everyone.
and thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rahul.
Thank you, bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, bye.
So Saturday is a busy day for pediatricians, So today I was busily working. So I'm sorry that I had missed out the excellent talk of Dr. Rahul just now. So, but anyway, for the situation in Hong Kong, well, it's more or less the same. In fact, about 12,000 confirmed cases in Hong Kong still, and the mortality figure is the same. Just 210 had died from COVID, and up till now, we have very few imported cases. Almost no community cases confirmed. Once in a while, there could be a break in that record. And then those are the cases who got contact with the imported cases or at the border. So the recent imported cases had raised our alarm. They were two children of the consulates of the UAE, that is the United Arab Emirates, I remember. And these two children should be in their quarantine at home because recently the government had relaxed the quarantine for those consulate people, VIP, you know, coming from other countries, that let them have the quarantine at home. And these two children in their teenage had in fact traveled all around Hong Kong's tourist spots on the first 2 days that they arrived to Hong Kong, and then they tested positive. And the results came back that they had illegally broken the quarantine rules, and we saw had to had mandatory checks for many districts that they had traveled to. And well, luckily, we had not found a lot of, we had not found so far community cases that had got infected by these two VIPs. And so there's a call in the community. The people had really complained about the relaxation of these rules for those who had come back from other places, or for the consulate people who had come from other regions and be exempted or be allowed to have quarantine at home. Because quarantining at home really could not have the measures to guarantee that they really observe the rules, and after only detected after they had broken the rules. Okay, so and all these positive few cases entering Hong Kong carried the Delta variant. So far now, we really could not find any of those ancestral virus. And also we could not have, we did not find any alpha, beta, epsilon, or lambda variants that had been positive in many other places. And we hope that we would not have these variants coming to Hong Kong, because we heard that, of course, epsilon or lambda seem to be even more dangerous than the Delta variant. Anyway, we didn't have any cases of mucormycosis in Hong Kong. And so far, for the vaccination aspect, we have vaccinated 5 million doses. So more than half of them were BioNTech, and less than half were CoronaVac from Sinovac. And so more than 3 million had got the first dose. That is about 40% of the population. And then more than 2 million had got the second dose already. And so about 30% of the population had been fully vaccinated, only 30%. We still hope to achieve something like 70% of the population with the first dose by the end of September. But this is a difficult task to achieve, perhaps, because many people are still suspicious and hesitant. So those who are optimistic and compliant, they have vaccinated already. So we have to keep this turbo of vaccination upbeat, but we feel that it's more and more difficult now. So the government and the big entrepreneurs, the developers, they had to give more incentives. And so many different prizes were out for lotteries, etc. And even apartments were given as one of the prizes. So anyway, we hope that we could have some of the 70% of the population vaccinated. But our academics have thrown out ideas that even 70% probably is not adequate for the herd immunity now. They suspect that we need to have 80%. First, because of the mutant variants that could come to Hong Kong. Secondly, because perhaps the Chinese vaccine could not have the efficacy as good as the, say, BioNTech, and that might require the herd immunity to be up to 80% if we really want to protect ourselves. And we are not importing any new vaccines to Hong Kong. And of course, Chinese authorities have been saying that they might give the third dose of Sinovac or Sinopharm to their citizens. But in Hong Kong, we didn't find the scientific data really to support that yet. And we are also vaccinating the teenagers, 12 to 15 age group. And of course, the response is not as good as we expected. So we envy the good situation in Singapore in vaccinating these younger people. So hope that the parents would allow the children to vaccinate more and more open to this attitude. So that's all for Hong Kong. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alvin. Dr. Russell, do you have anything to add from Melbourne?
Well, Dr. Chong, you are fully updated with your son. Anyhow, 163 cases today in New South Wales. Victoria's 12, which is on trending well. Half the country's population is in lockdown. Delta is giving a big problem to New South Wales. Of course, New South Wales follow a different approach, have always followed. So even at this height, they are not fully locked down. They have only parts locked down, and they have a philosophy of sort of similar to the UK, what they're doing. But unfortunately, it's become bad, and it's moved to the southeast area, which is probably more populated, or at least closely. And so there's a big problem with virtually vaccine shortage is another thing, because everyone wants the Pfizer vaccine, and that's in short supply, but we have excess of AstraZeneca, but for many reasons, there's been some hesitancy. There's been some deaths due to the clots and so forth. So all this has led to some bit of turmoil where we once were doing probably very well. Relatively to other countries, it's still 163 is not much, and in Melbourne it's 12. And all are from isolation and so forth. So they expect to come out next Wednesday in Victoria. So that's the plan. But there's a problem, because we have the sea pigeon. So they're having a ring of steel. They're planning to keep no one to come from New South Wales out. They want to, they call it the ring. The Premier wants a ring of steel to not let anyone come from there and bring it to here. So that's as far as in South Australia is also in lockdown, but they're coming out. They had only 1 or 2 cases, right? So that's Australia for the moment. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Russell.
Yes. You go. I think it's important. I am giving today. They have, and I think Marthinda will know today. Saurabh, you know, today is the Dr. K.K. Agarwal's lecture by the Indian Medical Association, National Indian Medical Association, right? And at 4 o'clock, it's his series. I think they're giving and I'm giving the lecture today on Beyond COVID Crisis, Public Health Disaster Planning and Preparation for Tomorrow. It's related to Dr. K.K. Agarwal, a dear friend and member here. And so good. I thought I should tell you all that. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. And I'll just finish up because all the other participants for the next meeting is coming in. I'll just quickly summarize what's happened to Singapore. Singapore, we have 75% vaccinated with 1 dose, 51% vaccinated with 2 doses. So that's about 75% right now, doing about 70,000 a day. But what's fascinating is we have about 130 cases yesterday. So we've been having about 1,000 cases of Delta in the last 5 days, for example. And one interesting piece of data I just want to share with you is that from our data of Delta variant, which a lot of it is not coming from India, it's coming from Indonesia actually, because Delta is rampant there, came through on the fishery report. We found that partially vaccinated, those who are vaccinated, 0% needed oxygen, 135 cases. Partially vaccinated, 3.4% needed oxygen. Unvaccinated, 5.4%. So you can see it's 0, 3.4, 5.4%. Previously, with the Wuhan wild type, it was about 20% that needed oxygen. So indeed, the Delta virus is actually cooling off, right? Although it's more infectious, serial interval is 2.5 days, according to our data here in Singapore. And R naught is 5 to 8 as opposed to Wuhan 2.5. But it looks like the Delta is sort of, in terms of severity, seems to be coming down. That's our data here from Singapore. So without much further ado, thank you everyone, and we'll see you next week on Saturday again. And thank you all for all your participation. We always look forward to seeing you next Saturday at 12 noon Singapore time or 9:30 Indian time.
Thank you so
Anything
much.
else?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
I just like to also announce the next week topic. We already have a speaker, and it's a very important topic. It's a COVID vaccination again, but it is for transplant patients. So we have a doctor from US, and the details will be announced shortly in the group. Thank you everyone for joining in.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay,
you.
bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.